Hello, ladies and gents. Modern Political Ideas, Module DD316. Chapter 4 The State. What is it and what's it for? Page 70. In Hobbes' view, people without a state, a power to keep them in awe, have to rely on their own physical resources, their own strength, and their own invention. However, because all others will do the same, none will have the security needed to develop the various features of civilized life because any such endeavour can be taken from them. The fruit thereof is uncertain. The problem of political order for Hobbes is therefore how people can get themselves out from that miserable condition of where. For Hobbes, the answer lies in creating a common power that will be able to enforce older a state, or what he called the Levium, Leviathan, I don't even pronounce it, the idea of a mythical being with overwhelming power. In order to create such a power, Hobbes suggested the only way to erect such a common power is they may be able to defend them from the invasion of foreigners and the injuries of one another, and thereby to secure them in such sort as that by their own industry and by the fruits of the earth they may nourish themselves and live connectedly. It is to confer all their power and strength upon one man, or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices into one will, and therein to submit their wills, every one to his will, and their judgment to his judgments. And he that carrieth this person is called a sovereign, and said to the sovereign power, and every one besides is subject. Here for Hobbes, the foundation of statehood lie in the prioritisation of physical security. Recalling the point I made earlier, the political order includes managing relations with those outside of any given society. The common power will defend against the invasion of foreigners as well as from each other, the injuries of one another. The common power of or state may take different forms, one man or one assembly of men. And indeed, though Hobbes favoured monarchy as a form of rule, he acknowledged that an assembly of all democracy, or an assembly of a few, ruled by an aristocracy, were also possible. However, such a power would only be effected if the members of society, the Commonwealth, subject themselves to the rule of the state, submit their wills, every one to his will, and their judgments to his judgment. In arguing that the creation of a state to rule over securities creates a common power to provide a common source of security, in return for which the population carries a political obligation to obey the commands of the sovereign, Hobbes' argument can be seen as an idea of political order as coordination. That is a situation where independent choices by individuals focus on a single, mutually beneficial solution. Everyone prefers political order to its absence, the state of nature. So once it is brought into being, they all have an interest in its continuation. For those that didn't subject to the sovereign, Hobbes noted there was always the sword, for covenants without the sword are but bits of parchment. Is Hobbes' account of the end for a state to provide a physical security sufficient reason to obey the state? On one hand, the monopolisation of violence by a state delivers collective benefit to society as a whole by resolving the most basic problem of political order. However, you have already seen that this constitutive act is not the end of politics, nor is it the limit of what states can do. Once established, a whole series of regulatory actions then become possible. The Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume 1711 to 1776, argued that further forms of coordination were possible once the most basic problem of order had been solved. And just as coordination on the question of violence by creating a state delivered enormous gains for society, so further gains could be had through the general advantage which is reaped from the government. Hume 1741, page 98. The kinds of state regulation of economic life or state provision of education or health mentioned in section 2 become possible once political order has been established. However, the account of how it's presented here doesn't tell us how the Appian, once created, would exercise its power in a regulated way, nor distributive effects that it might be. Who gets what, when, and how? Throughout history, there have been many instances where power has been used to benefit elite sections of society to the detriment of others. In the aftermath of the financial crisis 2008, many criticised Western states for continuing to follow economic policies that led to a massive inequalities of income and wealth. There are also many cases where state violence has been utilised to oppress sections of the population. At what point do the situation justify rejection of states' control or violence? Many violent rebellions against states stem from this kind of calculation that, although there are gains to society from the coordinated power of a state, they are outweighed by negative effects on some parts of the population from coercion of exploitation, as shown in example South Africa in the box 1. South Africa provides one example of rebellion against a state. Under the apartheid system, which existed between 1948 and 1994, the state systematically protected the interests of whites to the detriment of non-whites. This included restricting what land and property non-whites could own and where they could live and work, creating severe negative distributional effects in terms of income, education, and life expectancy. Non-whites were also denied any say in these collectively binding regulations by being excluded from the whites-only government, which, within its racially defined limits, was run on partially democratic lines. The state commanded an extensive and effective security apparatus. As opposition to the system grew, led by the African National Congress, the state relied increasingly on force to maintain its rule. In response, the ANC adopted a campaign of violence against the state and its infrastructure. Widespread rebellion in the 1980s eventually led to negotiations between the governing party and the ANC, which brought an end to the apartheid system with a new constitution for the state of non-racial multi-party election in 1994. Legitimacy, sovereignty. The South African example brings into focus the question of how far the obligation to obey a key state extends for hopes. As long as a state did not transcend an individual's natural rights, largely limited the preservation of one's life. There are few reasons to reject the rule of sovereign. However, the idea that individual rights might limit how far one is obliged to obey a state subsequently provide a basic for liberal ideas on the need to curb state power. The idea that a state's power might be challenged in some way and also revealed in some returns to Weber's definition of state and looks a little closer at two parts of his definition. In the provision that states claim a monopoly on violence must be successful and legitimate. Let's take the issue of success first. As political theorist John Donne wrote, what is elusive Weber's conception is that the provision that the state claim in question should be successful. And legitimate. Let's take that issue success first. As a political theorist John Donne wrote, what is elusive in Weber's conception is the proviso that claim in question should be successful. States certainly vary today and across history in just how successfully they realise this claim in practice. Some states confront more thoroughly pacified or subjugated populations than others. But no state has ever confronted a widely pacified or subjugated population. This comment directs attention to an important qualification to the idea mentioned at the start of this chapter, that the state is often spoken and thought of as a thing. Weber's definition certainly suggests this is the phrase a state may exist. Before introducing his interesting qualification, and Hobbes imagined the state as the single, unitary, if fantastical, body of the Leviathan, but Dunn suggests a different idea, that the state is not such thing, and its social relationship between organisations, agencies, or agents of a state on the one hand, and a governed population and on the other. States claim monopoly over violence, but the realisation of that claim may be more or less successful. Stated in this interpretation is an ongoing political accomplishment that will vary over time and face changes of various kinds. Can you think of examples where state claim to rule has been challenged or brought into question? There are various examples you might choose where a state's rule is in doubt. The South African example cited above is one. Campaigns for independence, as have been seen in Catalonia in Spain, or Scotland in the UK, or part of the rejection of rule by what seemed to see as an alien state. Anti-colonial struggles were also based on the rejection of state rule, and where that state was ostensibly serving a Hobbesian purpose by providing the basis for political order. Indeed, proponents of colonialism made precisely this claim, that they were bringing order to stateless, ungoverned peoples. Not all those opposing states have themselves been violent, though some have been. The state's monopoly of violence can also be brought into question if it fails to successfully realise that monopoly organised crime in the United Kingdom states in the 1930s, or the armed drug cartels in parts of Latin America more recently, are both examples of where states have been unsuccessful in pacifying or subjecting some of their populations to their rule. The line of discussion can be extended of the second of Weber's provisions, that the state's monopoly is over legitimate use of force. But what do we mean when we say something is legitimate? The idea of state legitimacy has been present implicitly in the discussion of Hobbes in the sense of an obligation to obey the state. Sure, in Section 2, that the use of force was ultimate sanction to uphold laws. But that doesn't mean it is the first choice of action. In very many cases, it is not, or the most efficient or successful. In fact, states can be more effective where the repeated recourse to violence is not required. However, here the power of the state is more successful. The first of Weber's qualification, when it is legitimate, when people obey the laws, the constituted and regulated rules, because they are perceived to be right. The political theorist David Beetham, 1992, argues that power is legitimate when governments are formed and state power exercised according to established rules of the society. The rules of society about government and the state are justifiable in terms of values of the society. There is evidence of explicit consent to government and state power, typically, though not necessary, through some form of voting. Let's unpick this freehold definition a bit more. First, states generally try to legitimise their rule by claiming some kind of validity according to prevailing rules, even where power is acquired by means of other could, diktat, and so on. Power holders try to exercise this power in relation to some framework of rules if it is to be held over the longer term. Second, while these rules vary enormously from one society to the next and one time to the next, they have to be justifiable. Beetham 1992, page 11, maintains, in relation to beliefs and values of the people over whom state rules, that is, the rules of power who need to be seen as right by the population as whole. Third, legitimisation requires some demonstration of consent to seal legitimacy of the state. In democratic societies, this consent is expressed large part of the through election. In some totalitarian or authoritarian political systems, various kinds of mass mobilisation parades are used to create public shows of consent. Notably, though, Even in authoritarian political systems, managed electoral processes are still conducted to bolster states' claim to a right to rule, success, and sovereignty. This consideration of how successful is a state's claim to legitimacy led us finally to the question of sovereignty or attribute of states. Sovereignty is one of the trickier terms in political discourse. Like many political concepts, it is a term of everyday language and political debate, as well as a term of formal legal and diplomatic practice. As such, users can convey a range of different meanings. Sovereignty is often used in an everyday manner as referring to country or a state's ability to control its own destiny. States who are being pressured by external powers or international organisations to undertake some course of action or adopt some policy might claim that their sovereignty is being infringed. This makes the use of the word sovereignty rather broad and all-encompassing. There are many things that constrain a state's ability to achieve particular outcomes. They are hedged about on all sides, but by constraints all the time. The various regulative rules that states enact and seek to uphold may or may not be successful, and the extent to which the state accomplishes the ends it seeks varies not enormously. A narrow and, in my view, useful definition of sovereignty focuses not on the outcomes a state can control, but on how, where the ultimate authority to make collective decision, the right of rule lies. There is a distinction to be drawn, therefore, between the claim to elusive right to make rules, authority, and the capability of enforcing that claim, control. Thompson, 1995. That is the question of sovereignty. It is not whether the government is making the right decision or acting in an effective way, but whether it is acceptable that the government has the right to make those decisions. The success of a state's claim, whether in Weber's terms, to monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, or in Hobbes' terms of subordination of a claim to ultimate authority, the sovereignty, to use example from the UK, and the distance between, on one hand, criticising Parliament for enacting the law, and or that achieving a policy aims effective, and, on the other hand, questioning whether Parliament has an ultimate authority to make such decisions. Understands a claim or a right to rule. Sovereign carries with two further consequences. First, the sovereign rule to rule is one that needs to be recognised to be effective. There needs to be some degree of acceptance to claim to sovereignty by those to whom it is made. Second, the recognition has to come from members of the given society. The population must recognise who can legitimately rule over them, and externally by other states. A claim to be sovereign, therefore, faces both inwards, the political community over which rule is to be exercised, and externally in claiming that there is no other state or actor has the superior authority over its people and territory. A state may therefore be weak in terms of its ability to control outcomes, to grow the economy, say, or expand literacy or health provision, and may face severe economic or other constraints in its choice of policies, but it remains sovereign to the extent that it can continue to be recognised as the location of ultimate authority over a given territory and population.